since the Hamas attacks. And as we were talking about before the show, it's just incredible how fast this year has gone by.
It feels like just yesterday we were watching those images on the news, trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think for a lot of us, and I've been following this conflict for a long time, but last October it felt different. It felt like everything, the whole region had just crossed this dangerous threshold.
Absolutely. And I think that's why we wanted to do this deep dive now. Because as we mark this somber anniversary, the situation is, if anything, even more volatile than it was a year ago.
Right. We're talking about the ongoing conflict in Gaza, the Israeli military actions in Lebanon, Iran's now very public involvement, so much to unpack.
And sadly, it's not just about geopolitics. It's about real lives caught in the crossfire, a humanitarian crisis that seems to be escalating by the day.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So for anyone listening who maybe doesn't have all the details at their fingertips, let's rewind back to October 7th of last year. What happened and why was it such a turning point?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is the sheer scale of the attack. The source material called it the deadliest in Israel's history. Over 1,200 people killed. And it wasn't just the numbers, it was, well, everything.
The way it was carried out, the fact that so many of the victims were civilians, it was shocking, even for a region that's sadly no stranger to violence.
Yeah, and that detail about the Nova Music Festival, that always gets me. I mean, a peace festival. It's not a military target. It just speaks to a level of, well, I don't even know what to call it, but it's chilling.
It was a real shift in tactics, and I think that's something that's really important to remember as we try to understand everything that's happened since then.
Exactly. This wasn't just another attack. This was something different. It shattered this sense of, I don't know, maybe invulnerability that had existed in Israel despite the constant threat of terrorism.
And that brings us to today, because as we approach the one-year mark, there's a palpable sense of unease in Israel. I mean, they're planning memorial ceremonies, of course, but there's also this huge security operation underway.
The source material mentioned a massive police and military presence. Roadblocks, checkpoints, the whole 9 yards. They're taking no chances.
Which makes sense, right? Because the last thing anyone wants is a repeat of last year's tragedy. But at the same time, it creates this atmosphere of tension, of fear.
It's like this dark cloud hanging over everything. You can't escape it. The grief is still so raw, and then you layer on top of that the fear of what might come next. It's heavy.
Absolutely. And it really sets the stage for what we're going to be digging into today. The current situation in Gaza, the Israeli strikes in Lebanon, the growing Iranian involvement. It's a lot, but it's important. So let's take a deep breath and jump in.
Okay, let's do it.
And jumping in means, unfortunately, going straight to Gaza. Because a year later, the situation there is, well, it's incredibly bleak.
Bleak is an understatement, honestly. We're talking about a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
And getting worse seemingly by the hour, right? What was it,
Yeah.
over 1 million people displaced in Lebanon alone?
Yeah, the source material had that figure, over 1 million. And these aren't just numbers on a page. These are families, children, elderly people forced from their homes with very little support. It's a disaster.
It's hard to even fathom, and then you factor in what's happening inside Gaza, the ongoing military operations, the destruction, the casualties.
It's a cycle of violence that seems to have no end.
Ah.
And just this morning, the news broke about Jabalia.
Jabalia, you mean the refugee camp.
Right, one of the largest in Gaza. And now Israeli forces have it completely surrounded.
Which, strategically, you can see why they do that, but from a humanitarian perspective.
It's terrifying. Tens of thousands of people, many of whom were already displaced before this latest round of fighting.
So you're talking about a population that's already incredibly vulnerable, living in crowded conditions with limited access to basic necessities.
Exactly, and now they're caught in the middle of this. It's a nightmare scenario.
It's hard to see any easy answers here, and that's before we even get to the situation in Lebanon.
Right, because this conflict has now spills over borders, with Israel directly targeting Hezbollah with airstrikes.
Which is a whole other can of worms, isn't it? Because Hezbollah isn't just some fringe group.
No, they're deeply embedded in Lebanese society. They have political power, military capabilities, even social programs.
So when Israel bombs Hezbollah targets, it's not just about hitting those specific locations.
There's always collateral damage. And the source material mentions civilian casualties, damage to infrastructure.
23 casualties reported yesterday alone, right? Plus the Beirut airport was hit.
Which, again, you can see the strategic logic, disrupt Hezbollah's supply lines and so on. but the impact on ordinary people is undeniable.
Schools in Beirut have already pushed back the start of their year until November.
It just speaks to the level of uncertainty, the fear that people are living with.
And as if things weren't bad enough, we have to add Iran into the mix.
Right. Because Iran's involvement is a game changer. Up until now, they've been playing a supporting role, but in the last few days, that's changed.
They've claimed responsibility for firing missiles into Israel, which I don't remember them ever doing so explicitly before.
It's a major escalation. And it's not just the act itself, it's the message it sends. We're not backing down, we're willing to engage directly.
Which then, of course, elicited that very pointed response from Israeli Defense Minister Gallant.
That was a chilling statement. He basically threatened Iran with the same kind of military action we're seeing in Gaza and Beirut.
Which, knowing the capabilities of the Israeli military,
It's a very real threat. And it raises the stakes considerably. Because now you have a situation where any miscalculation, any escalation could spiral out of control very quickly.
it's a lot to take in, and it really does feel like we're on a knife edge right now. So with all this happening, with these tensions so high, what's the international community doing? Anyone trying to step in to maybe dial things down a bit?
There's definitely been a lot of talk, a lot of strongly worded statements, calls for calm, for restraint, for both sides to come to the negotiating table.
Right. I mean, we've heard from some pretty big names. Schultz, for example, the German chancellor. He's been pretty vocal about the need for a ceasefire.
Yeah, and Pope Francis, too, always carries a certain weight, a moral authority.
Absolutely. And even Makati, the Lebanese prime minister, who, let's be honest, is in a really tough spot right now.
Caught right in the middle of it.
Exactly. But even he's been pushing for a peaceful solution, so that's got to count for something, right?
It should. But then you have things like Macron's statement yesterday about maybe halting some of those arms deliveries to Israel.
Yeah, that raised a few eyebrows, to put it mildly.
It definitely didn't go over well with Netanyahu. That little back and forth they had, that public spat, not exactly a good sign.
Not exactly the spirit of international cooperation we're hoping for.
Right. And it really underscores just how delicate the situation is. Because if even traditional allies are having these very public disagreements, it makes it that much harder to present a united front, to actually apply pressure, to maybe get some movement towards a resolution.
It's a mess. That's what it is. And I don't know about you, but I find myself struggling to see a clear path forward. I mean, we started this deep dive talking about the anniversary of the Hamas attacks, the grief, the trauma, and now here we are a year later talking about a potential regional war.
It's overwhelming. And honestly, I don't have any easy answers. No magic solutions.
But you've been studying this region, this conflict for a long time. So I got to ask, from where you sit, where do we go from here? Is there any hope?
There's always hope. Has to be, right? But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried. Because when you look at the situation on the ground, the level of mistrust, the anger, the pain on all sides, it's hard not to feel a sense of dread.
Yeah, I hear that. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical chess game, the military strategies. But at the end of the day, it's the human costs that really matters. The families that have been torn apart, the lives that have been lost, the futures that are now uncertain.
That's the real tragedy here.
And it's what we all need to remember as we try to make sense of this conflict, as we search for a way forward. It's not a game. These are real lives at stake.
Well said.
And on that note, I think, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up this deep dive. It's been a tough conversation, a lot to process, but I hope that it's given our listeners a better understanding of the complexities, the nuances of this conflict.
You too.
Because only by understanding can we even begin to find a way to heal, to rebuild, to move forward.